Matthew 20:20-28. Then the mother of Zebedee's son came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down asked a favor of him. "What is it you want?" he asked. She said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus said to them. "Can you drink the cup I am going to drink?" "We can," they answered. Jesus said to them, "You will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many."
Love is not self-seeking. That is the phrase from 1 Corinthians 13 that we get to look at this morning. And if you are already following along in terms of turning to 1 Corinthians 13, in the NIV, it says it is not self-seeking. But depending on what translation or what version you use, you get similar phrases, but a little bit of different wording. For example, in one version it says, it does not seek its own benefit. In another, it says it does not insist on its own way. Another says it does not demand its own way. The Message paraphrase just simply says, it isn't always me first. Now, I don't want to speak for you, but I have to say that each week of this series, and my hope is that you've been with us for each week, and as always, if you haven't, make sure you catch up and watching those. But for me, this has been a very fun series, not just for current circumstances and situations in my life that I find myself in, which is good for every time we open God's Word and we learn together, but also just taking a look back and thinking about past situations, past circumstances, things that have happened in my life before, that all throughout this series so far, when I've heard these teachings, I've thought, oh man, I wish I would have responded that way, or I wish somebody would have said that to me when this situation had happened, or simply just when I was younger. And my hope is that you feel that way too if you've caught other weeks, but also that you can say, oh wow, look at how far I've come. I still have a long way to go, and I still have so much to learn when it comes to these love is phrases, but yeah, I've put that one into practice, and look at how far I've come. You know, I was told this, but I don't have memories of this being that little, but I was told, you know, some of my first words were no and mine. Were you told that? You were told that? Perhaps. Now here's what I've learned. My wife and I have been blessed with 4 kids. Guess what my 4 kids said very early on? Me, mine, no, right? Okay. Some of you know me from when I was younger, and so you're hold your amens, please. But when I was younger, in high school, I liked to play the game of basketball. And when I was in high school, I played a lot of basketball, and I thought I was pretty good. And like I said, I have learned a lot through this series, all right? But in high school, I was very me-focused and me-centered. And so, like I said, some of you knew me. I played in a church basketball league here years and years and years ago, and I can remember sometimes I'd come in and John Russell, who was our former pastor, he wouldn't even have to say anything. He'd just look at me, and I knew Shama, somebody called the office and told me in the church basketball league, you were being too me-centered. And I'd be like, oh, sorry. No. Right? But in high school, I can remember, just constantly my coach would have to remind me that it wasn't about me. That I had to involve the whole team. And I can just remember dealing with that. And still, just this idea of it being competitive in sports and just wanting it to, me and involving the team. And what's interesting is now I have kids, but I also coach a lot of different kids in the game of soccer. And so I see how that plays out now in my current life. I remember early on in ministry, the question anytime I ran into somebody else from another church. So how many people go to your church? How many people are in your youth group? How many people are in this? Maybe you've heard people ask that question, but that is a me. That is a self-centered question. It's like, okay, so I work here and this is what I'm doing, but how many people are coming to hear me? How many people are coming to see the things that we are doing and are putting on? Like I said, my wife and I have been blessed with 4 kids. And I tell you, the whole love is not self-seeking. As a parent, I have had to learn that over and over. And from the time my kids were young and even until now, just every day is a different opportunity to teach, not being self-seeking. And I have joked with people before, but with the 4 kids that we have now, one's away at college and he comes home sometimes. And so that means even more trips to the grocery store. But I have learned how self-seeking I can be when I go to the grocery store with kids. Have you experienced this? Have you ever hidden groceries in your car? I mean, like you ever gone through the aisles and then thought, well, I want that, but if I take it home, I won't get to eat that? I've joked before, I never knew how self-seeking I was until I found myself with the lights off in our pantry eating double stuffed Oreos. I told my wife that the other day. She goes, you've done that? She must be a saint. I think she's done it too. But truly, and I still, I think about this as well. My wife and I really like coffee. And where we live now, there are multiple coffee spots very close by. And your phones are great these days. You can pay with your phone, but you know what your phone will also tell you? Where people are and what they just bought. And sometimes I'll come home and I'll have a coffee, and my wife will say, did you get one for me? And I like to play the game. I like to hide hers in the car. And I'm like, oh no, I didn't know you would be home. And then I go out and I'm the hero. But I even think about that just in a small detail like that. I'm on my way home and being thoughtful. I want this, or I could really go for a pick-me-up this afternoon. I bet she's at home, and she's been home with the kids and eating Oreos in the closet. Maybe she'll want a coffee. But just thinking about those are a few examples for me. And maybe you can identify with some of those. But what do? They demonstrate an innate leaning in each of us, I think, to look out for number one. Paul said this, not just in 1 Corinthians 13, but he said it throughout all of his writings to different churches. He knew that people had this leaning to not only look out for number one, but to put themselves on a pedestal and look down at other people and to be self-seeking. One of my favorite examples in ministry that I continue to flesh out for people, oftentimes I do this in premarital counseling. I point out in Ephesians chapter 5, there's this passage of scripture where Paul talks about submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, and he goes into the roles of a husband and a wife, and about halfway through, he says some very powerful things where he says, husbands, love your wives like you love your own body. And he points out just this idea that you care for your own body. You think about yourself and your basic needs, that there is this innate thing in each of us to go, I'm going to get mine. I'm going to take care of myself. And so I share that with couples, but that for me is an incredible example of just how we are wired to at our basic core, oftentimes seek out what we need, what we want, what we desire. So if love isn't self-seeking, what's the pursuit? What are we supposed to chase? Love seeks the needs and the desires of others before yourself. And so to see how this can be lived out in our lives, we again today get to look at a story that takes place in the life of Jesus. And if you know anything about this series, you know we've started with these phrases from 1 Corinthians 13, and then we've immediately gone to, so let's look at the Gospels. And let's look at the life of Jesus and see how he interacted with people and how he demonstrated what we are to learn from those phrases from 1 Corinthians 13. And so to start, let's go back a few verses before what you just heard Deb read. Starting in verse 17 of chapter 20 of Matthew, it says Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. And on the way, he took the 12 aside and he said to them, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he will be raised to life." And so at this point in the life and the ministry of Jesus, for these disciples, them going to Jerusalem wasn't a surprise. They weren't caught off guard by the first thing that Jesus said in verse 17. They weren't caught off guard by that. Their movement south from where they were in Galilee towards Jerusalem would have been something they were used to because Passover was coming. And they had celebrated the Passover feast before. Jesus himself had celebrated this before. And so that first part of those verses for them, it was just, they ignored that part of like, of course, we're going to Jerusalem. Where else would we be going? We're on this road. We've traveled this. Other people are here doing the same thing. We know what time of year it is. Yeah, we get that, Jesus. And it also wasn't the first time that he told them what was going to happen. He had alluded to this many times before in the book of Matthew and in Mark and Luke and John. That he had told his disciples, he had tried to explain to them what was ultimately going to happen to them. And he used different words each time and things, but it was all the same. And so this wasn't the first time he said it. But they were so focused, it seems, on Jesus establishing a kingdom. And for them, you know, they had longed for a king. They had longed for a Messiah. They had longed for somebody that would come and set things right. And so they just, yeah, you're going to set the political scene and the ruling world right. Yeah, we get that. That it's almost like everything that he said right after that went over their heads. That they were anticipating this immediate reversal of who was in power. That they didn't capture what Jesus said he was about to do. And what Jesus said he was about to do demonstrates, I am not self-seeking. When we get to Jerusalem, something is going to happen. And I am committed to it. I love how the book of Luke talks about this resolve that Jesus says. In Luke 9:51, in the ESV, it says, the days drew near for him to be taken up. And he set his face to go to Jerusalem. There's another translation that said his face was set like flint. That Jesus knew what was to come and he had a steely resolve. That is where I am headed. Not just for Passover, but what this means. Because Jesus knew also this would be the last one. Like I said, he had celebrated Passover before with these guys. He had celebrated it, I'm sure, earlier than that with other people. Oftentimes when we share in communion, like we will in a little bit, one of the verses we talk about sometimes is Jesus in the communion meal. He looks at them and he says, I've longed to share this meal with you. You remember what he says next? Because I tell you, I won't share it again until I come into my kingdom. Jesus knew what was to come. He knew when we get to Jerusalem, some things are going to happen, and we're going to share a meal together, and that'll be it. That'll be the last time I gather with them. But he keeps going. And he keeps going with a group of people that are just like us. They have a lot to learn when it comes to not being self-seeking. And why do I say that about them? Because of what you just heard read out loud. Verse 20 and 21, it says, the very next thing, it says, the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus. They're traveling together with her sons, and kneeling down, it says she asked a favor of him. That is putting this softly. What is it you want? He asked. And she said, "Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." That is a huge request. Something that's interesting to note is the Gospel of Mark. The parallel account of this story says James and John asked this question. It leaves out the mom in Mark. Why is that? Scholars and people say, well, by the time Matthew wrote his gospel, which was years after Mark wrote it, the disciples, these original followers of Jesus, had become so canonized, so to speak. They were considered such holy and high, honorable, saintly men that they didn't want to ruin their reputation to the early church. They didn't want these other people that had looked to these young men of faith and these original guys as being anything less than holy and upstanding. And so they're like, we'll put it on the mom, you know? But either way, she asks it. It's also interesting to point out that James and John were likely Jesus' first cousins, which meant this woman would have been his aunt. And so this was family asking family. And so maybe, just maybe, Jesus would take care of his own family. I mean, his own flesh and blood, right? Maybe at least two of the three inner disciples would get spots 1 and 2 on the podium when Jesus came into the kingdom, right? I mean, somebody has to sit at Jesus' left and somebody has to sit at Jesus' right. It might as well be James and John. It might as well be your cousins, Jesus. It might as well be these men that you've grown up with and done all of these life-changing things with. I mean, it couldn't hurt to ask in advance. If you read the other Gospels, it's also clear. James and John weren't the only people that had this mindset. This was a reoccurring controversy among the disciples all the way up until the Last Supper. If there were seats to be claimed, the disciples wanted to pick their seat. They wanted to lay their claim. They were competitive men. They were keeping score why in order to get ahead of each other. They were self-seeking. And you look at how this request is made. It says she knelt down to ask a favor. You know, when I read that and I imagine what that must have been like, her posture, it implies surrender and worship. I mean, reverence and honor. I mean, could you imagine your aunt, after seeing the things that you've done, yes, but just like bowing at your feet. And so Jesus is experiencing this. And so clearly she has a lot of belief in who he is and what he's done up to that point. I find my stuff struck by that. Because if I'm being transparent, sometimes I approach God this way. I know who he is. I believe in how powerful he is. I've seen him do things in my life. I have prayed prayers and he has come through in ways that I couldn't have even imagined or thought to pray. But oftentimes when I do talk to God and know how powerful he is, it can be very self-seeking. I can very quickly turn to, I want, I need, I desire. God, I know how powerful you are, and in light of that, will you give me what I desire? Over and over, I think you too, need to learn and remember what Jesus himself prayed. Not my will, but yours, God. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it already is in heaven. And so that's what Jesus is trying to teach in his response. Verse 22, he says, you don't know what you are asking. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or my left, it is not for me to grant. These places, they belong to those for whom I have been prepared by my Father. I love that in Jesus' response, he doesn't rebuke them. And he also doesn't deny what they say. He doesn't deny that his kingdom is coming, and he actually doesn't deny that there will be seats of honor. He doesn't dismiss that. He looks at James and John, who are obviously right there with their mother, and I sometimes imagine what that must have been like, right? Are they standing behind her? Are they like hiding? Are they going, oh, Mom, I can't believe you. Like, Jesus, I'm sorry. Like, ask her, right? I don't know. But they're right there with their mom when she asks this big question. And Jesus says, you don't know what you're asking for. He asks them, can you drink the cup I am about to drink? And I think with commendable bravery and probably thinking and speaking way too quickly, they say, we can. She asks the question. He asks them a question, and they immediately respond, we can. These were the sons of thunder. They were very bold, very confident, very brave, but not very smart. I mean, I can't imagine saying that. Jesus doesn't turn them down. He doesn't put them down. He doesn't say, well, you'll never have a place of honor at my table. You guys are way off base. No, what does he do? Two things. And the second thing that he says, I want to start with, he gives a humble response. He says, to sit at my right or my left, it's not for me to grant. Jesus himself says this. Guys, the question you're asking, it's actually not even up to me. Even if you are the two that I would pick, I'm going to submit to the will of my Father. I will not seek myself. Again, Father, not my will, but yours. And then he gives a haunting promise. You will indeed drink from my cup. That is a hard statement. That is a big declaration. And the disciples, I don't think they realized what that meant. But they will. The concept of the cup in the Bible, it is an intense personal experience. You've heard us talk and teach about this before. It's the same image that Jesus used in the Garden of Gethsemane when he is praying to his Father. When he prays that the cup of suffering might pass, and he says, this cup that I am going to drink, this cup was the burden of what he was going to take upon his own shoulders, the sins of the world. In the parallel passage in Mark 10, Jesus also mentions when they ask this question, can you be baptized? He mentions baptism that is about to be undergone. And he's not referring to water baptism. Instead, he's referring to this full-on immersion in suffering that would be fulfilled on the cross. James and John, when they have their mom ask this question, I think they assumed their suffering was over. I think in the years that they had spent with Jesus and the things that they had seen him do and the opposition from the Pharisees and the Sadducees and everybody else, or just the different things that had happened to them, I think they thought that was it. I think they thought, wow, okay, this was a few years of just kind of some chaos and really highs, and yeah, now we've got to get out of town really quick, and Jesus, people don't like us, and people certainly don't like you, but wow, we made it, Jesus. Here we are. The suffering is over. Maybe they thought they had fulfilled their duties as two of the three that had really, been with Jesus, and like, we were your right-hand men, and now your left-hand men, right? The thing is, they were wrong on all accounts. Their suffering was still ahead of him. Jesus knew that. Jesus knew their work was just starting. Jesus knew there was a lot to be done after he left. He says, when we get to Jerusalem, I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be arrested. I'm going to be falsely accused. I'm going to be spat upon, mocked, beaten, and I will be crucified. And nothing that was going to happen, those things that Jesus said were going to happen and he foreshadowed, those weren't a surprise to him. Jesus went to Jerusalem with a steely resolve, with full knowledge of what was about to transpire to him, but also he knew what was going to happen to James and John. He knew when he said, you will drink from my cup. He knew what his cousins were going to face. Only he could pay for the sins of the world, but they could, and they would suffer with him. by being faithful to him. If you know anything about what happened to the disciples, James was first. In Acts chapter 12, he was put to death by Herod Agrippa. He was probably beheaded. He was the first of Jesus' followers to die. He drank from the cup in a violent and brutal way. Then you get Andrew and Peter and Philip and Bartholomew and Thomas and Matthew, James the Lesser, Thaddeus, Simon, Matthias. Every single one of them were killed. And every single one of them weren't just killed of like, yeah, they fell off their donkey. They were murdered for their faith in brutal fashion for being followers of Jesus. And John, you know how John died? Old age. John was the last apostle to die. He was almost 100 years old. He'd been exiled to an island, then he ended up in Ephesus. He dies of old age. And when I think about their question, I think about Jesus' response, I think about Jesus is saying to them, and he knew, you guys are going to be bookends. You're both going to drink from my cup, and the cup's going to look just completely different. One of you is going to go out in a blaze of glory like you're Mel Gibson in Braveheart. And the other one is just going to fall asleep. You guys are just going to be these bookends for the rest of them. But you both have to die. I think Jesus would want us to comprehend the same thing. It's certainly possible, but the likelihood of you or I dying a martyr is likely not going to happen. You know what's far more likely? We're going to age. And we're going to face illness and disappointment, disillusionment. We're going to face loss. Maybe it's going to be a job. Maybe it's going to be a kid. Maybe it's going to be a parent or grandparent. We're going to face just promotions and demotions and all kinds of things. And it all adds up to simply a daily struggle to not be self-seeking. It's what Eugene Peterson would say is a long obedience in the same direction. Our lives are probably going to look far more like John's than James. To draw close to Jesus means the cup he offers, though, has to be accepted. Following Christ is a call to die. You get to verse 24. It says the other 10 are listening. And when they heard about this, it says they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together. He huddles them up and he says, you know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Indignant, I think, is bad. Obviously, the other 10 are ticked off. Wouldn't you be? I mean, if you had followed Jesus and there's two guys, well, there's three that obviously get top billing with Jesus and they're hanging out with them and they come back sometimes telling these crazy stories. Like, guys, we went up on this mountain and like two other guys from the Old Testament showed up and it was amazing and we tried to build a tent and they were like, we don't need any tents here. And then we came back down and you missed it, haha, right? Like, can you imagine being the other 10? Of course they're ticked off. Of course they're upset. Why do these guys get such a high honor? Jesus, how come they're pulling you aside? What about us? What about me, Jesus? And you notice Jesus doesn't respond the same way to them. He doesn't say the same exact things to them. He's already alluded to the cup that's going to come. He knew how it was going to play out for them too. He just calls everybody together and he contrasts what? He reminds them, this is how the world operates. Guys, this is how you've grown up. These are the rulers. These are the people that have been in charge of you, that have been in charge of us. You know how the world has run right now. And he contrasts it all with 4 really good words. Not so with you. You know what way it is. Not so with you. Instead, thinking of others and their needs and their desires is what makes you great. You guys want to be leaders? Great. I know what's to come. I know what you're going to face, but okay, you want this? You want to be a leader? You want to be right there with me? Get down. Serve. That ladder you keep trying to climb up, get off of those rungs and throw the ladder away. Remember everything I've done to this point. I didn't come to be served, he says, but to serve. Every interaction, it wasn't about me. Those people I healed, those people that I picked up so they could walk again. The walking on the water was for your faith. The calming of the sea was for your faith and your belief and your trust in me and my Father. It wasn't for my own, it was to serve and to give my life. And what I'm about to do next, I'm going to give my life as a ransom for everybody that's going to believe in me. I love how he says that. And I love how just thinking about what he said here in the larger context of what's happening. Because it's not like he said that and then immediately it says Jesus was crucified and a light bulb went off and they got it. No, they just kept walking. He said these big, powerful things and his face was turned towards Jerusalem and they kept going. And I point that out because of what happens after this. That the very next verse in Matthew 20 says Jesus and his disciples are going and a crowd gathers. Of course a crowd gathers. They want to see Jesus. They've heard about Jesus. They want to catch a glimpse. And as that's happening, 2 men who are blind call out. And the crowd goes, "Be quiet, stop it." And they call out again. And Jesus stops and he asks a very similar question to the same question that he asked to James and John, James, John's mother. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus loves to ask that question, it seems. Here's why I think this is important. This is a question you and I have to ask. And I think we have to ask it in 2 different ways. I think the first way we have to ask it, if we're going to be more like Jesus, if we are not going to be self-seeking, but instead to serve, we have to first think about our posture towards God and say, "God, what do you want me to do for you?" The same question that Jesus was willing to ask to others, we have to ask. "Father, not my will, but yours be done. What do you want me to do for you?" And here's what's going to happen. You ask that question, you inevitably will begin asking that question to other people, which is what Jesus did. What do you want me to do for you? And as we've seen up to this point, as we will continue to see and looking at these little phrases of what love is, we will continue to discover Jesus was intentional in everything that he did, and in his intentionality was a desire to follow God and to serve others. May we be a people that do that and do that so well. And so as we end, I actually want to read a passage from 1 Peter 4:10. It just serves really just as an encouragement and as a reminder of how this continues to be lived out. Each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others. Why? You're a faithful steward of God's grace. So if anyone speaks, they should do so as one who speaks the very words of God. If anyone serves, they should do so with the strength that God provides. Why? So that in all things God may be praised through Jesus Christ. And now to him be the glory and the power forever and ever. Amen. May we be people that are marked by that. Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for the gift of your Son and the life that he lived and the things that he taught. And Father, I thank you that even in the mess and in the self-seeking, his response was in a way to turn those original askers and hearers and listeners' hearts to your Father. May we do that as well. Father, may we seek your face. And as we do that, may we serve. And may our faces become more like your Son as we do that. Pray this in the powerful and saving name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.